itself under Rumsfeld, where you had this, you had a very downsized army surrounded by contractors. And as things got worse in Iraq and Rumsfeld refused to send more troops, that meant that contractors filled the gap. And you had this very dramatic mission creep that we're continuing to see. Now, this is part of what I'm arguing is the shock doctrine, because that crisis created a context where there wasn't a debate about whether private contractors should be involved in interrogation, or whether
In fact, nobody has any clue about the extent of really the private operation that exists alongside the army in Iraq at this point, right?
Well, in fact, we get glimpses of it only through scandal. This is what's really quite remarkable, is that this agenda that was pushed through after September 11th, and then in the crisis as the war in Iraq, went off the rails. If you read the New York Times or the Washington Post and the reports on what's going on with Blackwater in Iraq, you hear, there is between 20,000 and 48,000 private security firms, private security soldiers in Iraq. Well, how many? I mean, why is there such a gap between, there could be even more. We don't have any accurate count. So what we're finding out is, this was never debated. There was never a public discussion about something as crucial. Security, the fact that it's the government's job to provide security, that's a constitutional mandate. Right. So there was never this debate, and we find out about this corporate mission creep scandal by scandal. Right. So during the Abu Ghraib scandal, we find out that it wasn't just soldiers who were involved, there were private contractors who were involved in the interrogation. And when there's a shootout in Baghdad and the Iraqi government says they want to ban Blackwater, we find out, the extent of Blackwater's involvement there.
The reason that we rely so heavily on contractors in Iraq, it's not, I can see that it looks kind of dodgy that you have these conflicts of interest where you have somebody like Cheney coming out of Halliburton, you have Halliburton profiting off of the war. But it seems to me that more than the profit motive, I don't think that's terribly significant. It seems to me that this is a lot of times sleight of hand, that there's been a reluctance troop level because it makes the war seem more burdensome than it actually is.
I think there's also an ideological component to it. And I think if we look at who the key figures of this administration are, and also the key figures who demanded this war most loudly, they are embedded in this economy of disaster. And Dick Cheney and his wife on the board of Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin in the 90s was the major engine of this vision of a hollow government. When Clinton slashed military spending, and Lockheed and other weapons companies started to see that they needed to diversify because their main area was shrinking. Their main market was shrinking. Where Lockheed started to diversify was saying to the government, okay, we already have security clearance, so there's all kinds of functions that you're performing that we could do. So Lockheed starts, sorting the mail, cutting welfare checks, performing core government functions, and this hollowing out of the government was really being pushed by that company. Halliburton was doing the same thing on the military end. So I'm saying it's both ideological and it's financial. I mean, this seems clear.
So you're saying
for those personal people, Dick Cheney with his massive Halliburton holdings, do you think he's doing it for charity? I mean, I'm really mystified that we think such wonderful things about.
I don't think wonderful things about it, but I think that maybe he drank the Kool-Aid when he was
but the Kool-Aid was also really profitable. I mean, these things are simultaneous because you have an ideology that conveniently is a justification for greed. I mean, the ideology is pursue your greed, feed economic growth, and everything will be fixed in the trickle down. Like I can't separate the ideology from the self-interest.
But I also see a lot of other people who were prime architects of the war who didn't have this financial incentive. Somebody like
oil's gone up to $75.
But it's been a flop for these guys on a lot of levels. I mean, their reputations are ruined. It's somebody like Rumsfeld. It's hard to know what he's going to do. Well,
he's starting a think tank about the connection between security and free market economics.
Right. QED.
All right. The liberation of Iraq was created by a former vice president of Lockheed Martin who didn't have to sell his shares. George Shultz was the chair of that. We need to ask for who, because for Halliburton, for Lockheed, for Gilead Sciences, for the key, for Bechtel, and it's been a failure. This has been a disaster. We need to ask for who, because for Halliburton, for Lockheed, for Gilead Sciences, for the key, for Bechtel, and another figure who was really very prominent
You're talking
in
about
beating the drums of war.
You're talking about a very narrow sector of the whole economy, but one in which...
But I'm talking about the people who really created the case for this war. I mean, the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq was created by a former vice president of Lockheed Martin who didn't have to sell his shares. George Shultz was the chair of that committee, and he was on the board of Bechtel the whole time. So yeah, I realize it seems simplistic and obvious, but I believe that
I'm going to have to cut you off because we're going to have to take a quick break, but we will after the...
Klein and Franklin 4 continues.
It's been a failure on some levels, maybe not all levels for disaster capitalism. What are the implications of the parts of the war that have been a failure for this theory?
Well, I mean, I do think that it has been chastening in terms of that cracking open that part to distort policy, because they have an active economic interest in continued instability. And I think that what we're seeing, and what's quite worrying, is I talk in the book about the Davos Dilemma, and this was discussed at this year's World Economic Summit in Davos. Every year there's sort of a buzzword, and this past year it was the Davos Dilemma. And what was the Davos Dilemma? Well, according to Martin Wolf, a columnist in the Financial Times, he described the Davos Dilemma as the paradox that the world was becoming more unstable, more crisis-prone, basically going to hell in a handbasket, high oil prices, war in Iraq, potential of a nuclear strike on Iran, climate change, Middle East crisis, and so on and so on. But at the same time, the stock market was doing very, very well, and there were record levels of economic growth. So this was the Davos Dilemma. What is this paradox between between political crisis and economic benefit?
Isn't it interesting that in this kind of heart of the
wasn't even identified as a sector before September 11th is now worth $200 billion, and
elite, and a lot of other parts of the elite find this to be troubling and against their interests.
I think that's absolutely true, but it is an extraordinarily politically connected part of that elite, and I think you see that very clearly in Washington and the Homeland Security complex. This is really a sector of the economy that wasn't even identified as a sector before September 11th is now worth $200 billion, and that economy is utterly embedded in Washington lobbying and funding for political parties, because it's not a normal economy. It's not in the free market. It's entirely dependent on getting government contracts. So it trades entirely in political influence. This is why the biggest problem at the Department of Homeland Security is that they can't hold on to staff. That you have to protect the homeland against any conceivable threat and respond to any possible threat abroad as if it's a 100% threat. So this is, from a military perspective, unwinnable, but from an economic perspective, unbeatable, because you have absolute security in that market, because that war can't end.
Let's continue to unpack your description of what's happened.
What the war on terror is as a new economy, with the Bush administration playing the role of venture capitalist, of deep-pocketed venture capitalist, that the way in which the war on terror has been defined is a war against evil everywhere forever, against an enemy that you can't talk to because all they want is your annihilation, so that you have to protect the homeland against any conceivable threat and respond to any possible threat abroad as if it's a 100% threat. So this is, from a military perspective, unwinnable, but from an economic perspective, unbeatable, because you have absolute security